Midsi Sanchez was only 8 years old when she outsmarted a predator, escaped captivity, and uncovered a serial kidnapper hiding in plain sight. What she did in the darkest hours would lead to one of the most shocking true crime cases in modern history. On a bright afternoon in August of 2000, 8-year-old Midsi Sanchez was walking home from school in Vallejo, California. It was a short walk, the same one she had taken many times before. Her neighborhood was quiet. Her family was waiting just minutes away, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The sun was shining, kids were still playing outside, and people were going about their day. But this ordinary day would soon take a horrifying turn that would shock the entire community. Midsi was in the 3rd grade and had asked her mom earlier that day if she could walk home by herself. It was a big step for a young girl, but she felt confident, and her parents trusted her. After all, it was only a few blocks. But at some point, during her walk, Midsi disappeared. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it happened in silence, so fast that no one noticed. 1 minute she was walking on the sidewalk, and the next she was gone. When Midsi didn't arrive home at the expected time, her family grew worried. At first they thought maybe she had been delayed, or maybe she stopped to talk with a friend. But as the minutes passed, worry turned into panic. Her parents began calling neighbors, checking the nearby streets, and eventually called the police. It didn't take long for authorities to understand that this wasn't just a case of a child wandering off. Something much more serious had happened. A massive search was launched almost immediately. Police, volunteers, neighbors, and even complete strangers joined the effort. They combed through streets, alleyways, parks, and abandoned buildings. Helicopters circled overhead. Flyers with Midsi's picture and description were printed and distributed all over town. Her disappearance was reported on the local news, and the community was urged to remain alert. People were afraid. If something like this could happen in broad daylight to a child walking home in her own neighborhood, it could happen to anyone. Despite the scale of the search, there were no solid leads, no eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage, no clues left behind. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Her backpack was never found. Her schoolwork and belongings offered no hints. The trail went cold almost immediately, leaving both investigators and her loved ones in a state of helplessness and heartbreak. Days passed, and still, there was nothing. Rumors began to spread, and tips poured in from all over, but none of them led anywhere. Her family was trapped in a nightmare, forced to imagine the worst while clinging to the hope that she might somehow be found alive. Each passing hour made that hope feel more fragile. The pain of not knowing was unbearable. And just when it seemed like all hope was lost, something completely unexpected happened that would change everything. The case, which seemed to be slipping into darkness, was about to take a shocking turn. 3 days after Midsi Sanchez disappeared, nearly everyone feared the worst. Search efforts had turned up nothing. Her face was on every telephone pole in Vallejo, on news broadcasts, and on the front pages of newspapers. Yet there were no signs of her. The community was beginning to prepare itself for a tragic ending. But then an event that seemed unrelated at first suddenly brought the case back to life. In a nearby city, a man named Curtis Dean Anderson was pulled over by police for a routine traffic violation. To the officer, it looked like a standard stop. The driver was calm but jittery, cooperative but overly polite. As the officer approached the vehicle, something about it felt off. In the back seat, he noticed a bundle of items that didn't seem to belong in a car meant for running errands or commuting. There were ropes, duct tape, children's toys, and a notebook with crayon drawings. Something wasn't right. When the officer asked Anderson a few simple questions, his answers were inconsistent. He couldn't explain why he had those items or where he had been over the last few days. He became increasingly nervous as the officer pressed further. Eventually, the officer decided to bring Anderson in for questioning. At the time, they had no idea who he was or what he had done. It wasn't until they searched his vehicle more thoroughly that the connection to Midsi Sanchez began to unfold. Inside the car, investigators found something chilling. Among the ropes and restraints was a notebook that appeared to belong to a child. Inside were scribbled notes, some with the name Midsi written in a young, shaky hand. There were school assignments, personal drawings, and even a few journal-like entries. Suddenly, the missing child case that had gone cold just hours before was wide open again. Anderson wasn't just a suspicious man with strange items. He had something that linked him directly to the missing girl. Authorities wasted no time. Anderson was detained, and a full investigation into his background began. What they uncovered sent shockwaves through the police department. Anderson had a long criminal history that included prior arrests for kidnapping and violent behavior. His pattern of behavior fit exactly what investigators feared. The more they looked, the clearer it became. Curtis Dean Anderson wasn't just a criminal. He was a predator. Meanwhile, families across Vallejo watched the news unfold with horror. If Anderson had Midsi, what had he done to her? Where was she now? And more importantly, was she still alive? The pressure on law enforcement skyrocketed. Every second felt critical. Search teams were redirected. Interrogations intensified. The investigation became a race against time, but the story was far from over. What no one expected, what no one could have imagined, was that this case would not follow the usual tragic script. While everyone was searching for answers, the girl at the center of it all was about to do something extraordinary. While police pieced together evidence and interrogated Curtis Dean Anderson, something remarkable was happening behind the scenes, something no one could have predicted. Locked inside Anderson's car, hidden from view and trapped in fear, 8-year-old Midsi Sanchez was still alive. For nearly 2 full days, she had been chained to the floor of the vehicle, isolated, terrified, and completely unsure of what would happen next. Her abductor had kept her moving, avoiding detection by changing locations and blending in with normal traffic. But through it all, Midsi was watching, thinking, and quietly planning. Despite the fear that surrounded her, Midsi's instincts were sharp. She remembered every turn the car took, every item her captor used, and every word he spoke. She took note of the tools he carried, chains, padlocks, and handcuffs, and how he used them to control her. She saw how he got distracted when using a payphone, and how he grew careless when he thought no one was looking. These little moments became her fuel. Rather than falling into panic or despair, she made a choice. She would not give up. She would survive. On the 3rd day of her captivity, Anderson pulled into a parking lot and exited the car to make a phone call. For the first time, Midsi was left alone long enough to attempt something risky. Though chained to the car, she had been slowly working the restraints, testing the locks and studying the movements of her captor. She knew this might be her only chance. With trembling hands, she reached for a set of keys Anderson had left near the driver's seat. She stretched, twisted, and fumbled, but finally she got them. Then she did something even more daring. She unlocked her own restraints. Once the chains were off, she didn't wait. She opened the car door and sprinted toward a nearby business, her small body moving faster than it ever had. A worker nearby saw her and immediately knew something was wrong. She was barefoot, crying, and clearly in distress. The worker rushed to her side and called 911. Midsi told the police everything: the car, the chains, the man who took her. Officers arrived within minutes, and Curtis Dean Anderson was arrested shortly after. News of her escape spread like wildfire. It wasn't just that she had been found alive. It was the way she had rescued herself. Children rarely escape kidnappers on their own. Most are too scared, too small, or too traumatized, but Midsi had done the impossible. She had not only survived her abduction, she had outsmarted her abductor, broken free, and told her story with strength and clarity. Police, reporters, and even veteran investigators were stunned. This wasn't a rescue operation. It was an escape mission led by a child who refused to give in. And because of her courage, not only was she safe, but the authorities now had the key to unraveling a far darker story that had been hiding beneath the surface for years. After Curtis Dean Anderson was taken into custody, investigators began the difficult task of digging into his past. What started as the rescue of a single child quickly spiraled into something much darker. Authorities discovered that Anderson wasn't just a man who had made one horrifying choice. He was someone with a deeply disturbing history that had gone unnoticed for far too long. As detectives examined his criminal record, they found a long trail of previous charges, including crimes involving violence, kidnapping, and assault. He had been in and out of prison for years, yet somehow he had managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system repeatedly. He was known to law enforcement, but not fully understood. With Midsi's case now at the center of attention, investigators looked closer than ever before, and what they found shocked even the most experienced officers. One of the most heartbreaking discoveries came when Anderson began to talk during interrogation. He claimed responsibility for the disappearance of another young girl, 7-year-old Ziana Fairchild, who had vanished from Vallejo nearly 2 years earlier. Her case had gone cold, and her family had lived in anguish ever since. Now, there was a new connection. Anderson confessed that he had taken Ziana, held her captive, and eventually killed her. He even offered details that only the person responsible could know. Forensic evidence would later confirm the truth. The remains of Ziana Fairchild were found months later in a remote area, bringing a devastating end to a case that had haunted the community. Anderson's confession opened the floodgates. More cases were re-examined. Other families came forward with stories of suspicious behavior and encounters that suddenly made sense. A clear pattern emerged. Anderson had been targeting young girls. For years, he was a serial predator who had perfected the art of hiding in plain sight. He worked as a cab driver, giving him access to children and the cover of being a harmless, familiar face in the neighborhood. The realization that he had operated so freely for so long sent a wave of anger and sadness through the town. Even more disturbing was Anderson's attitude. He showed little remorse. During interviews, he shifted between smugness and indifference. He spoke about his crimes with chilling calm, as if they were ordinary events. At times, he seemed to enjoy the attention. But what truly unsettled investigators was how close he had come to continuing his crimes. If Midsi hadn't escaped, there's no telling what he would have done next, or who his next victim might have been. Thanks to her bravery, Anderson's reign of terror came to an end. Her escape didn't just save her life, it exposed a hidden monster and brought long-awaited answers to other families. It gave police the evidence they needed to put him away for good. The case that began as a desperate search for a missing child had grown into something far bigger, the unraveling of a predator's secret life and the beginning of justice for those he had hurt. In the aftermath of her escape, Midsi Sanchez returned home to a world that had changed forever. Her safe return was a miracle, but the trauma she had endured was impossible to erase. The story of her survival made national headlines. She was celebrated as a hero, and rightfully so. But while the public focused on her incredible courage, Midsi was left to rebuild her life, piece by piece, at just 8 years old. Counselors and therapists were brought in to help her cope with the emotional weight of her experience. Her family, overwhelmed with relief, stood by her side as she tried to make sense of what had happened. For Midsi, every day was a new challenge. The nightmares, the fear of being alone, the constant reminders, it all lingered long after the headlines faded. But through it all, she showed the same strength she had during her escape. Slowly, she began to heal. Meanwhile, Curtis Dean Anderson faced the consequences of his crimes. In court, he was charged not only with the kidnapping of Midsi, but also with the murder of Ziana Fairchild and several other serious offenses. He was sentenced to over 250 years in prison, ensuring he would never be free again. He died behind bars a few years later, taking with him the full truth of how many children he may have harmed. Some questions were never answered, but justice, at least in part, was served. As Midsi grew older, she made a remarkable decision. She refused to let her past define her in a negative way. Instead of hiding from what happened, she chose to speak openly about it. She gave interviews, shared her story, and used her voice to raise awareness about child abduction and survival. She wanted the world to understand not only what she had gone through, but what others like her were still facing. Her mission became even more focused when she launched a foundation to help support the families of missing and exploited children. Through her work, she connected with other survivors, law enforcement agencies, and advocacy groups. She turned her pain into purpose. What had nearly destroyed her became the reason she worked so hard to make sure no child ever had to feel alone, scared, or forgotten. Years passed and Midsi continued to grow into a powerful figure in the fight for children's safety. Schools invited her to speak. Parents looked to her story for inspiration and guidance. She became a symbol of hope, proof that even in the darkest of situations, there is a chance for light. Not many people can say they changed the world by the age of 8, but Midsi did. And she kept going. Her story isn't just about survival. It's about resilience, strength, and the power of one person to make a difference. What began as a terrifying crime ended as a story of triumph. Midsi Sanchez didn't just escape a monster, she helped stop one. And in doing so, she gave countless others the strength to keep fighting.